I would say the opening meeting with the Russian side was frosty. I said, I'm not here for a social call. I know exactly what you did in Salisbury. You killed one of our citizens. We know the nature of our relationship. There's going to be no turning the page, no return to normal, no cooperation for the sake of cooperation. We've tried that. We've tried 25 years of cooperation and got nowhere. I'm John Foreman. I was a captain in the Royal Navy until January this year. I was previously Defence Attaché in Moscow from 2019 to 2022, including the period during the invasion and its build-up and consequences. Previously, I was a Defence Attaché in Kyiv from 2008 to 2011, and I'm the only British officer to have been DA in both countries. I joined the Royal Navy in 1983. I was inspired to join because I saw some of the TV programmes in the 1970s, the sailor and the warship programme, and the life of being in the Royal Navy looked fantastic. Opportunity to travel around the world, and my aunt had been in the Wrens and my father had done national service. So yeah, I joined in '83. I was a warfare officer. I served at sea basically for 20 years on everything from aircraft carrier to frigates to mine hunters. Navigator. I was a commanding officer of a couple of ships, and then as you get more senior, the opportunity to go to sea was less, so I worked at the Ministry of Defence because I became a communications electronic warfare specialist. Went to America, worked at the Pentagon on the US Navy staff, and it's really from there that my opportunity to get into the world of diplomacy opened up. So I, from America, after training, went to Ukraine 2008 to 2011 after Ukrainian training. Came back, we went to the Gulf, worked on coalition maritime forces in Bahrain, Naples for NATO, shaped during the Ukraine crisis, NATO Defence College. I then worked for the European Union, believe it or not, the last days after the referendum, but before we Brexited in 2019. Not the greatest period, but then suddenly I was plucked out and said, hey John, you've been in Ukraine as Defence Attaché, do you want to go to Moscow? And after a quick one day's discussion with my wife, I said yes on the Monday, and by the Friday I was a candidate, and 6 months later I was in Moscow. Looking back, what does people say, that all political careers end in failure? You always want one more time. I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd done that. But actually, if you say, hey, I speak to audiences, they say you were in America, Kyiv, Ukraine, Italy, Brussels, Bahrain. You've been around the world in the ships. Commanded. I think I would take that. And I think actually the fact that I ended up being uniquely Defence Attaché in both Kyiv and Russia was the crowning glory, really. I mean, I said I've always been fascinated with Russia and the Soviet Union, visited there as a schoolboy, but then the opportunity to take that schoolboy interest all the way through to being the Chief of Defence Staff's representative in the Russian Federation was, well, everything I could wish for. When I was in Washington, I liked obviously the capital city, massive navy. You could have real impact about the voice of the non-US Navy in terms of investment. And I think just understanding how America worked, and I think also the values on which America was built really resonated with me about America as this sort of shining city on the hill, as Reagan put it. I liked Ukraine because we were down seeing this country still emerging from the Soviet Union as a free independent country on its journey. We're trying to help it along that journey to where it wants to be, part of the European family. Through to Russia, you had to be on your A game because the relationship between Russia and Britain after 2018 was particularly difficult. And being sent there, and my friend who sent me there said, John's a tough gig, and he was right. And then to see Russia, I've always wanted to live in, I've visited, but I always wanted to live there. And then to see it close up as it descended from 2020 through to the invasion, and sort of dictatorship we see now. So being able to witness the history. But I think it was, the time to end on that high, really. So I came back, did 3 months and left. I didn't want to hang around because who's going to employ me back in London after all that sort of travel and experience? For me, in the terms of Moscow, the work became 100%. There was no balance between life. I mean, also I had a nice life in Russia, but everything was consumed by living in Moscow and work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day availability. So I've been very careful to try and regain that balance since I've been back, because I've retired now. I don't want to be that person flogging myself as I was. It's not good for you. And I was speaking to a very senior British journalist a while back, and we both agreed that when you live in Russia, it takes time to get over it, especially all the pressures and psychological pressure, physical pressure we had during our time together there. So I've been very careful. I want to see more of my own country. I want to live and see my parents, my friends, and just get a bit of equilibrium back in my life. Defence attachés were normally temporarily attached during war, such as the Crimean War, or to embassies. And in the late 19th century, it was decided to have military officers attached to embassies to provide advice to the ambassador and to be the conduit between the UK and that government. So we had British naval attachés in Berlin before the First World War trying to work out what the German fleet was up to. And then feeding it back to the Royal Navy and saying, look, this is what the German Navy's up to, change your plans. And then it became more professionalised in the course of the 20th century, but still essentially to be this conduit, this sort of channel of communication formally between the Chief of Defence Staff and his Russian equivalent or his Ukrainian equivalent. That's number one. I think 2 is to provide advice, cogent, calm, objective advice, both to the ambassador on military and security matters, because they come from the FCO, they don't have the background, and also back into London as well. So a friend of mine who was working in DI, Defence Intelligence, said to me, I want to know what it feels like, what it look like, and what people are saying to you. Not what does it mean beyond the sort of headlines and the sort of people thing on paper, what's your judgment? So I think that's the role. I mean, normally in Moscow we would have had a large defence section. You had a 1-star, you'd have had a deputy, various assistants, but because of the Skripal affair, everything had been reduced. So the problem we had was the demand from London was enormous, but the supply was small. So hence that sort of being consumed by work over 3 years. But I think hopefully I was able to stay objective. There's no point in going native, as it says, no point in becoming a sort of pleader for the nation you're living in. You've got to be representing UK interests there, passing it to the other side, passing complaints or protests or diplomatic notes, and being the recipient of Russian ire when things get difficult. We've got 90 attachés around the world now, or sections, and I think you could probably plot those attachés on a line between friendly and hostile. With those nations' relationship. And of course some nations we're trying to move into the friendly camp, others we won't achieve it, so it's much more transactional. So my friend who's the Defence Attaché in Washington will have a very different experience, relationship with his host government than I did in Moscow, or my friend did in China. When I was in Ukraine, I had a different relationship with the host nation than I did in Russia. So not even 2, quote, post-Soviet countries had very different governments, very different needs, very different relationships. So I would be much more on the assistance side and advice in Ukraine. In Russia, it's much more about understanding what Russia's up to and providing warning signs and signals back to London to say, things are getting pretty grim here, you need to wake up, pay attention. I mean, the thing about Ukraine is it at that time had aspirations to join NATO, and our advice and training, we had the second largest bilateral funded program, to train future officers, language training, practical training for soldiers, courses, ships, both in Ukraine, back in the UK. So we were always looking at how do we help Ukrainian armed forces build for the future to be, quote, interoperable with NATO. As well as helping Ukraine maintain civilian control over its military. So, and that's not without its difficulty, because there are those who are more open to advice and those who aren't less open. But that's human nature. The knack was to find out who your key interlocutors were who will help you achieve change. In Russia, it's completely different, very hostile. Our military cooperation had been formally suspended after the Skripal poisoning in 2018. We'd expelled huge numbers of diplomats from London and vice versa from Moscow. I managed to re-establish a channel of communication between Chief Defence Staff and General Gerasimov before the war. We achieved limited rewriting of treaties to keep our sailors and airmen safe when we're in close proximity at sea. We did some ceremonial stuff and remembering World War II and veterans, but it was very transactional. And of course, in the lead up to the war, on the invasion, we were using those channels, including visiting Mr. Wallace and Admiral Radic and visiting Moscow, to actually set out the consequences of Russians' illegal actions in Ukraine, to deter them from attacking and to spell out what would happen in terms of economic and political and diplomatic isolation. I arrived in Kyiv in the summer of 2008, and a week later Russia attacked Georgia and South Ossetia. And we said, this is a wake-up call to European security. I was watching David Miliband give a speech in Kyiv saying, Europe must wake up. And of course we slept on. And in that period, 8, 9, 10, it became clear that the Russian-Ukrainian relationship was not great, and that by all means, prepare yourself to work on peacekeeping operations with NATO, but in the Balkans, whatever. But actually, what's your considerations about the Russian threat? No, they're our allies, they're our friends. They'll never do anything. Russia would never attack us. So, officially, we were still helping them doing peacekeeping, but I was trying to encourage them to think, what if Russia became an adversary? Where your command and control system, where your headquarters, your structures, what sort of training do you need? Let's be a bit more robust, rather than just patrolling and vehicle checkpoints. Your hearts and minds, humanitarian assistance stuff, a bit more into the combat skills required, leadership for young and senior NCOs and officers. But again, it's what the host nation wants. And then in 2010, the government changed, became much more, they called it multi-vector, balance between east and west. And although we carried on doing some reasonable cooperation, I think the impetus for reform was not there. If you dial it forward to 2014, obviously impetus came back again because they had been attacked by Russia, had Crimea annexed, they'd had the 31 Donbass, the Russian army had entered into Ukrainian proper, and that's just a further catalyst for much more focused, targeted assistance, which I think look collectively over the last sort of 30 years support to Ukraine. Did we contribute? Yes. But it's been sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think war is a mother of invention, of necessity, and I think Ukraine has realised that, as I said before, that schism between Russia and Ukraine is widening and permanent. Ukraine must reform, and is reforming, to better defend itself and to be part of the European family. Russia was already undermining Ukraine when I was there. It had been since independence. As I said, the FSB, the Federal Security Service in Russia, role was in Ukraine, was to undermine it. So they were corrupting politicians. They were allegedly murdering political opponents, poisoning President Yushchenko during the election campaign, using the Russian Orthodox Church as a sort of agent provocateur amongst the Ukrainian population, stirring stuff up in Crimea and the Donbass. So that was all going on. Maybe I'm just a slightly more pessimistic and gloomy individual, but you know, I've never trusted the Russians. I've been to both countries. I thought that Russia had aspirations to put the old gang back together again, and certainly since Putin became president and started to destroy very tentative Russian democracy in the early 2000s, and then through this 2007 speech in Munich. So that for me was the direction of travel. But I understand, you know, a quarter of Ukrainians have Russian family. They're linked by religion, they're linked by wartime suffering and sacrifice, they're linked by experience on the communists, persecution. So the history goes back, you know, 300 or 400 years, and they thought the common history. They thought that Russia would never do such a thing, and up until the last minute. In fact, I think President Zelensky said the same thing. About the same time, I think a lot of people in the West who had optimism bias and didn't want to think that Russia would ever attack Ukraine. Oh, they won't do that. I had my attaché colleagues telling me, John, you do not understand. No, Russia will never attack Ukraine. It's just a big game. This is all just a big pretext to gain concessions on security in Europe. But again, I think the combination of the mood, the propaganda, the intelligence, and the actions on the ground in terms of moving troops around, I think it was all pointing in one direction. And the only question was, you know, would Putin actually pull the trigger? But effectively, the direction in the last, 20 years has been Putin's been absolutely obsessed with Ukraine because of his imperialist sort of fantasies about the Soviet Union and the past of eternal brotherhoods, the stuff he was brought up in the 60s and 70s, and that sort of Brezhnevian period. There was a deliberate effort by the West to bind Russia into the family of nations, G8 membership, World Trade Organization, economic support, reform support throughout the 90s and 2000s. And I think my previous ambassador said, that was laudable and that was the right thing to do, and it didn't work. We probably reinforced failure as things became clearer with Putin's regime, and certainly after the invasion of Georgia. It struck me that the invasion of Georgia is 2008, and then 2014 comes along, annexation of Crimea, and every time you have these sort of great calls, Europe must wake up, we must do more. And then when 2022 comes along, oh, it's happened again. So I think there's been an awful lot of wishful thinking, especially in our European partners, that they couldn't see or didn't want to see where Russia was going. They wanted to reinforce their own previous approach that, through trade and dialogue, Russia will become nicer and friendly and part of the family. I think it was misguided from 2008 onwards, at least. But I think probably the failure in the early 2000s, when Putin started going after the oligarchs and started to clamp down democracy and started to take money and re-centralise it under his power structure, it was pretty clear. It's just that it takes a time to move the battleship or the super tanker of state. It takes a time to change course in terms of policy. But I think the real, final nail in that realisation process was the invasion in February 22. Even when you see the French and the Germans, and Italians, and the European Union, sort of how much it's really startled, how much Finland has joined NATO, Sweden has joined NATO. People have finally realised the nature of Russian power, and Putin in particular. I knew the Russians in Kyiv, I got quite well actually with the Russian attachés professionally. I think you have to sort of separate, as part of being a calm, objective assessment and advice. Don't let your personal feelings get in the way of it too much. And, personal one-to-one basis, no problems. I think when our name went in the hat, it goes up to the UK side, you become the candidate at some time because of the way the visas are all done. You ask the Russian side, we got agreement from the Russian side quite quickly. I've always wished I could see my file, whether my file is like this big or feet high of paperwork in the Lubyanka. But then, obviously you get there, and I had 3 years. I think they normally lay off you a little bit to start with, just to see what you're up to, and then the surveillance starts and intrusion and all that. But I think it's just part of the game, part of the gig, really. I went into the appointment wide-eyed. I was not subject to optimism bias. I thought, if I could achieve a couple of things in my time there, great. But if I didn't feel I had to be rewarded by doing stuff. Actually, not doing stuff was just as good as doing stuff. And of course, 2020 with the pandemic, so I was helping the embassy as well, feedback on the Russian pandemic response, but also the background of still doing stuff, militarily. 2021 is when things started to descend quite quickly into 2022, and that's the last 9 months was just, year and a half was just taken up by before, during and after the invasion and what it meant. But I think I've been banned now, so I must have done something right along the way. But I think I joined an interesting list of American comedians, British think tankers, David Cameron, Barack Obama, so the Russians, I would hope that our sanctions are targeted, both on those around Putin's circle of power and also those contributing to the sustainment of the Russian war machine. The Russian sanctions, personal sanctions, tend to be they get a list up, they just throw some hats around, names out of the hat, and it gets bundled up, so it's not very targeted. And people have been on there who've died, who are no longer in Parliament, so it's not particularly forensic, I think. But I've been quite vocal about what I think about Russian military criminality in Ukraine, about the nature of power in Russia, the descent of Russia into tyranny. So I wasn't surprised that my name finally made it on the list. I wasn't trusted, no. I mean, they regard me as some sort of, well, they see me as their eyes. The Russian attachés abroad all come from the Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, the poisoners of Salisbury. Therefore, they regard me as the same. Well, obviously, I'm just some sailor who happened to have worked in Ukraine and done some other jobs. So we have a different model of where you come from. I would say the opening meeting with the Russian side was frosty. And they started saying, John, we can do this, do that, blah, blah. And I said, I'm not here for a social call. I know exactly what you did in Salisbury. You killed one of our citizens. We know the nature of our relationship. So I see, our relationship in these terms. We see the relationship in these terms. There's going to be no turning the page, no return to normal, no cooperation for the sake of cooperation. We've tried that. And I'll say the same thing back to London, to say we shouldn't try and normalise or turn the page with Russia. We had to stay firm in our relationship, especially with the Russian military, because we tried 25 years of cooperation and got nowhere. We'd had some in Kyiv after the period when the Orange government fell and the NK, which came to power in 2010. So it stepped up on the Ukrainian side. And then in Crimea, we got followed around by the FSB, Russian FSB in Crimea. I used to visit down there. But again, I always thought it was part of the work. There's a normal background level of it, of surveillance. It's a symptom of the sort of state you're working. Same in China. Nobody trusts anybody. They all try to find out what you're going to do, who you're talking to, why you go to these places. I would hope, and if my colleagues from the FSB are watching this, that it was broadly professional. I didn't try and lose them deliberately. I didn't try and piss them off. And conversely, they were pretty professional towards us. I think things deteriorated after the invasion. And numbers had already gone up. Numbers kept going up of people following you. They started following my wife. There were more reported flat entries amongst the attaché community. People coming into the houses. I don't think ours, but people coming into houses to check bugs, plant bugs, that sort of thing. But I think once you accept, it's just the way of life there. You just get used to it. And we had a couple of instances of and surveillance turned more into harassment, but I think that was isolated, and normally just done to coincide with something else, so we would just be used to send a message to the British side. I always said, look, if you're not willing to put up with that, you shouldn't go to Russia. You know, it's always been like that. There's always been surveillance. So trying to imagine it's like some sort of nirvana is unrealistic. Military modernisation was deemed completed in 2021. So they'd had this huge amount of money spent on the Russian modernisation, and certainly they got more kit. More sort of exercises, big parades, new uniforms, and the sort of standing of the Russian military in the Russian public had never been higher, ever, by 2020, end of 2021. And actually, was they're projecting that we were a big modernised force, and Gerasimov told us, to our faces, that he had achieved parity with the Americans in 2022. And so I worked in America. I know what the American military is like. I never regarded the Russians anywhere near parity with the Americans. But this was the image of projecting of proud prestige. We're a great power. Great power has to have a big army, and look at our army, and look how fantastic we are, the heirs of World War II and the victors over Nazism. But I said there was an awful lot of problems inside the Russian military before the war. They hadn't done large-scale combat operations since the war. They were very intellectually rigid to their education. The exercises they were doing were all very scripted, so there wasn't modern at all. It was just like a show. It was all like a big facade. The problems of bullying still. When you meet the soldiers, very top-heavy. The soldiers, conscripts and soldiers weren't particularly high quality. Weapons were better, but they're not modern. There was no parity. So I was warning Londoners, we shouldn't talk ourselves into Ukraine being defeated. They're not 10 feet tall, the Russian army. Every army has its own strengths and weaknesses, and so it was the same. And I think it turned out that actually Gerasimov's new modern army was very much like the Soviet army, which was very much like the Imperial Army, the Tsarist army. Had problems with corruption and incompetence and poor leadership, poor generalship. Was a reflection of the Russian society itself. You couldn't say that the Russian army was separate. If you have a decrepit Russian state and then say the Russian army is, outside of all that, no, it's all part of the same society. So I was said that they had improved their ability to deploy at smaller scale further afield. They deployed quite quickly to Kazakhstan beginning of 2022 to help put down a coup. When invited by the Kazakh government, they sent peacekeepers down to Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, but they were unproven, and obviously, as we saw during the war, all these faults came through. I think it's interesting when you see the parades and how Putin brought these parades back. And they in the Soviet period, victory parades in May none happened for 20 years. Then they were every 5 years. And then Yeltsin, they stopped, then he came back. And then Putin made it this big razzmatazz thing. And it's all dripping in Tsarist and communist, World War II, now modern iconography, medals, icons, very strange uniforms. But they tried to associate themselves with the World War II army under Zhukov, defeated the Nazis on the Eastern Front. A massive, hugely powerful machine. So they tried to associate themselves there. They tried to live, but they didn't. I think they were misguided. That the legacy of communism, the legacy of obedience and the lack of reform actually left them halfway between a full-scale army and a peacekeeping army. They were sort of somewhere in between. So they were overconfident. Also, Gerasimov telling us that he thinks they're reached parity with the Americans, then that tells you. And actually didn't survive, a week in Ukraine. They thought the whole thing would be over in a couple of weeks, and here we are 2 years later. And they've been turned, the army, which was built over 10 years, has been turned to dust, and that professional army, quote unquote, is gone. It's now been turned back into a conscript army. In fact, what's interesting for me is how much the Russian army is reverting to type in terms of bullying and terrible leadership and disregard for casualties, and not giving the Russian soldiers food or medical support or giving them a decent burial, just treat them as cannon fodder. So I think it shows that sort of cynicism, that those deep-rooted societal issues are still very much there in the Russian army. On the military side, I think the breakdown in 2022 of the Russian army into basically a militia, was deeply shocking for the Russian people, and the casualties, obviously trickling back. And then, I think that was the first year was very difficult. 2023 they got more of a grip. At least they managed to defend themselves against the Ukrainians, but not really an attack. So I think that sort of the prestige in the eyes of the Russian military themselves, as well as the public, has been dented significantly. And they are desperate, the Russian military, to regain prestige, I think, in the next decade or so, how they do that. But there's also, I think, society been, rallying around the flag moment. People have support, and the government has encouraged people to support our boys in the field and change the narrative from being a special military operation against Ukraine to being part of a global struggle against Western imperialism and that sort of propaganda. So I think the reason there haven't been large-scale protests is because the police state has been built by Putin. I think that every year in Russia things have been worse than the year before. So in my time in Moscow, we had Navalny was poisoned. We had destruction of civil society movements. We had Navalny then returns and arrested. The protests against Navalny's imprisonment were broken up with violence in Moscow. You had rigged elections. So the trajectory of civil liberties was downwards anyway, and it's only redoubled since the invasion. More money's been spent on security services, more intrusion, claims there are fifth colonists who need to be shot, locked up, further show trials. That's why there's a whole climate of fear in Russia now. And people look at it, I think, and there'll always be those who will brave to stand up against things like we saw in Nazi Germany, and there will be those who basically keep their heads down and say, "Well, we're living in a police state dictatorship. What options do we have?" They just get resigned to their fate. There'll always be those who are collaborators with the regime, loyalists, super patriots. To be honest, you don't need many more than 25-30% to control the whole country, and you just rely on the acquiescence of the rest of the population. Russians aren't stupid. Again, there's that sort of myth that the Russians are all sort of ignorant peasants, just get told what to do and just blindly. And I think that's completely wrong. I think we've seen over the last 30 years, Russians are not Soviet. Russians want things that we want, like roads and education and schools and opportunity to travel and good jobs and pay and all that sort of stuff. And the Russians who've experienced the post-Soviet period are less receptive to the sort of stuff that Putin propagates. But I think there is a sophisticated propaganda campaign with associated ideology, also crazy ideology, which sort of mixes various themes which resonate with the public, whether it's we're under attack from the West, or that we won the war against Nazis and Ukrainians are Nazis, or we need a strong leader to guarantee Russian security, or the army is nobly fighting on our behalf, just as our ancestors have done, or the church, that Russia is somehow the keeper of traditional values handed down by God through Jesus. All this sort of stuff gets mashed together. And a friend of mine wrote, he said, this is esoteric. This smorgasbord of ideas is esoteric to us, but the Kremlin is very good at finding out what works and doesn't. So it presses various buttons. When it finds stuff that works, it reinforces those. Things that don't work, they get laughed at, they get stopped. So I think acquiescence, fear, apathy, despair, propaganda, history, an attempt to rewrite the history books now with a certain standard, one stream version of history that Russia's only had one history. There's no interpretation that the the past is historically true and certain. There's no debate. All that, I think, feeds into the mood of the Russian people, and it does. It maintains, adequate support, good enough support for the Kremlin. It doesn't need 100% support. It also keeps good enough support for Putin. Well, so that's my time in Ukraine. I knew how proud and patriotic and bloody-minded the Ukrainians can be. If you look at the figures in the Second World War, the numbers of Ukrainian orders of Lenin, heroes of the Soviet Union, was very high per capita. In terms of the partisan movement, was very strong, and Ukraine's been through a whole host of catastrophes, famines, political repression, invasion, civil war, re-invasion. So I wasn't surprised by the sort of general resilience of society and the passion and the pride of the Ukrainian armed forces. But I think what's come clear is that the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians and overestimated themselves. And I think Ukrainians had used the time wisely to prepare in the army, even if the politicians were still saying, Ukrainian politicians, this isn't going to happen. I think the army in certain sectors was preparing, but it was a very close run thing, I think, outside Kyiv in those early days. What gets small groups of men to carry on fighting to the death at various crossroads, or young Ukrainian officer cadets given rifles and rush into battle and stop the Russian army. What makes things go further in the south and less in the north? Why do some towns surrender and some refuse to surrender? I mean, it's a combination of factors, but we told the Russians, the Ukrainians are going to resist you, and they would thought, we're the Russian army. We defeated Hitler, and they said they would be in Kiev and marching down Kreshchachik in Kiev. And they didn't even reach some of the cities within 15 kilometres of the border. So, but I think you don't know until war starts. You can tell it. You can say it for as long as you're saying yes, they'll resist, they won't resist. But actually, so push comes to shove, do they stand or not? I think it's in our history as well. In the Royal Navy, it's sailors who make ships, not ships. As to what ships fight better than other ships, it's a complicated equation. I do think there is one victim here, is Ukraine, and one aggressor is Russia. There's no moral equivalence. Ukraine did not contribute to its own rape by Russia. It's the victim. I also think that, as President Kuchma, as the previous president said, Ukraine is not Russia. It's easy, I think, in the West just to use the phrase post-Soviet, former Soviet, that they're all the same. But there's a great difference between Russia, Ukraine, and indeed Belarus. As peoples, society, values, outlook, experience. And I think that trickles down to their armed forces. I think what's interesting, you can tell Ukrainians treat Russian prisoners of war with respect. Russian treat Ukrainian prisoners of war as basically, to be raped and castrated and shot or treated badly in imprisonment, as you found out with Sean Pinner. So Ukraine doesn't target civilian targets in Russia. Russia targets Ukrainian civilians as part of this terror campaign to damage public will, which is a war crime. So I'm sure there have been isolated instances on the Ukrainian side. Their discipline, their morale, and their values seem to be much stronger than those on the Russian side. So although they may have once come from the same family tree, I think there's a great difference. And we must see Ukraine, its history, its people, culture, military, separately, and assess it separately from that Russia, rather than sort of lump them together as one Putin-esque fraternal nation, which I think is inaccurate. It's 2024. As we said, Russia is not as strong or as weak as it looks. It's projected this thing, it's all inevitable. that Ukraine will have to come to the negotiating table. I think Russia has its own substantial problems with the economy, making sure that the public mood is not disturbed by another mass mobilisation, problems capacity and production in the military-industrial complex, the army itself not particularly able to really operate at scale against the Ukrainians. So I think their ambitions may be to bake in the current occupied areas, defend that, and wait for something to turn up. Whether it's change of president, another event, Ukrainians losing heart and coming to the negotiating table. But I think things are finally balanced inside Russia as well this next year because of the sort of other problems bubbling up on casualties or economic strength or indeed, people's the elite to say how long is this going to go on for. But Putin might be satisfied with what he's got so far, knowing that he bakes that in and then there's a chance for a further attack in 5-10 years' time. I think on the Ukrainian side, they're obviously disappointed with how things went in 2023. I think they've switched to defensive. I think for them, if they're not going to get huge amounts of arms, then the best they can hope is for to dig in, entrench, attrit the Russian army to prevent it attacking, and then get the arms and weapons in for a push in 2025. But it strikes me that 2024 is going to be a consolidation of the Ukrainians because they haven't shown the wherewithal or the ability or the equipment to actually achieve a large change in the front line. So again, I think we'll probably be not far from where we are in a year's time. But we started with a war of manoeuvre, Russia attacking, which quickly became, tens of kilometres, became a war of kilometres, became a war of metres, now it's a war of centimetres. Now hedgerows are being liberated heroically, or slag heaps. It's just become, from a macro scale, it's come right down to a micro scale. To be honest, the same what happened in 1914. We started the war of manoeuvre, and by 1915, 16, 17, it was trench warfare. It was only in 1918 where we managed to crack the nut and advance, but it took an awful lot of punishment to get from out of the defensive and attritional positional warfare back into manoeuvre. But the problem is, we've never really given the Ukrainians the stuff to do to get the job done. They've been trying to do it without air cover, without enough troops, without enough training, without enough artillery pieces and rockets, missiles. So we've been egging the Ukrainians on to do things which they really have struggled to do. But I think the economists captured it well. It's this like Passchendaele with drones. The nature of war in the trenches, violent, short, flooded, rats, snow, artillery, would be recognisable 100 years ago in the Somme and Passchendaele. It's just that some extra bits of technology have made things more complicated in terms of, seeing those trenches being droned. But actually, is that a completely new way of warfare, or is it just a smarter bit of artillery fire? So it's funny how much things change and how much stay the same. I think the offensive, called the Ukrainian offensive, which was stillborn, has caused a lot of disappointment in the West because of unrealistic expectations, egged on by people who thought that this is one more heave. This was Normandy 1944. We'll be in Berlin a year later, it's all be sorted. Moscow will be out of the war, peace and democracy, freedom, liberty, which I thought was all unrealistic at the time. So I think a combination of slow pace. There was already some sort of bitching between Ukraine and the West and Americans in and around the NATO summit, lack of vision at NATO summit to do with the Ukrainian membership perspective. So there's a sort of drift towards disappointments, and then Gaza enabled everybody to go like that and then focus on something else. So I think Putin's been using that, been stirring up and saying that sort of distraction of America in particular and trying to say now saying Ukraine's finished. You know, Russia, we're going to win. Ukraine must give up and yield to our territory, which I think is part of the information campaign. I don't think it's inevitable that Ukraine's going to lose, or that inevitable that Russia's going to win. I think it's still all to play for. But I think events, always were worry that events were going to distract and something else will happen. And it strikes me that many politicians in the West can't keep more than one crisis in their head at any one time. It strikes me that we're not blessed with, I'm talking generically about with politicians of these days who want willing to see the things through. And they're trying to put money where their mouth is. So we can all talk about this sort of freedom, liberty, but actually you need to invest in that as well. You need to set out to your electorate why this all matters. I grew up in the Cold War. When I joined the Navy in the Cold War, we had Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl and Mitterrand as our prime ministers and presidents. And I look at the current crop, shall we say, and I think to myself, because the legacy of the last 30 years of peace in Europe, it's very hard for people to sort of shape themselves out of the mentality and say, my God, we really face something serious here. And up with this we cannot have Ukraine fall to the invasion by a dictatorship on Europe's borders, not just because of the risk to European security, but the risk to global security. But some people get it, and I'm encouraged by Mr. Sunak and Boris Johnson's speech in the House of Commons on the invasion, setting out clearly the support of the British public and the European publics. But I am worried that without clearly articulating it, without a clear strategy, without a clear investment, there's a great risk that Ukraine will be forced to parley, and I think that'd be an absolute catastrophe for our interests and our values.